Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Turning Seminar Papers into Journal Submissions webinar. My name is Troy Mikanovich. I'm one of the senior consultants over at the Center for Writing and Rhetoric. And I've also worked on academic journals as the assistant editor for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and for Reading Religion Online. So as just kind of a note of organization, you'll see in the chat, and I'll also email them out afterwards to everybody who had registered, a zipped file with different resources that we're going to use, and I'll lead you through those in a second. This isn't going to be just a PowerPoint presentation webinar. Instead, we're going to use these different materials to kind of organize a few, set rules and tips for turning journal submissions, or pardon me, seminar papers into journal submissions. But it's going to require also just a smidge of participation on your end, not too much, don't worry. So to begin, if folks wouldn't mind either shouting out or explaining in chat, why are you here? What are your questions about, writing seminar papers, turning them into journal papers, that kind of thing? What's got people all bothered today?
You said to just shout out if we wanted.
Yeah, by all means. Stephanie, go ahead.
So I have a paper that is that was a seminar paper, and I want to submit it, but it's far shorter than what most of the journals require in their websites that about submissions. I also just kind of want to make sure that it's polished, so that it's not sounding so like homeworky and more a little bit more developed, because it's fairly new original research. So just trying to figure out how to navigate that.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And some of what you said there specifically about kind of making sure your work doesn't seem homeworky is kind of a central part of what we're going to be talking about. So thanks for bringing that up. Let's see what we have in chat. Finding the right journal to submit to. We'll talk a little bit about that. How to grow papers into publishable papers. We'll talk about this term publishable papers that gets sent around a lot in different programs here. Thinking about broader goals for your research, right? Starting maybe with a seminar paper to a journal article, maybe a book dissertation after that. Yeah, no, this is great. So the first thing I thought I'd do, because it is a mystery sometimes for folks who have never interacted with journal submissions, anything like that before, is to give a brief overview of what the journal submission process looks like, right? You all read lots of journal articles, but sometimes it is a little bit of a black box. For some of you, this might be very, very rudimentary, but I think it's still worth repeating, right? So let's say you are submitting your article to a, we'll say even top tier journal in your field. And I'll tell you why I make that distinction in a second. And so what happens to that article, right? Well, usually first what happens is the editor of the journal, one of the editors, if they have grad assistants, oftentimes this is what grad assistants are doing, they will do kind of a preliminary read of your article to begin with, of whatever you submitted to begin with. And they're looking for really high level, kind of higher order concerns. Is this a good journal for your kind of article that you're writing? Does it make sense? Is it readable? Things like, does it follow the standard conventions they're expecting? Can your argument be understood? Does it seem novel, like it's something that they would want to publish potentially? And kind of those higher level concerns. At that point, they can either do what's called a desk rejection, in which case they right then will say, nope, this isn't, we're not the right journal for you. Your paper isn't the right paper for us. And they'll just kind of reject it out of pocket. If they don't do that, though, what will happen is then they will usually, and this is why I kind of separated the, quote, high tier journals, because they have more resources usually, and so it's easier for them to do this. They will send it out to other people in the field for some sort of peer review. Now, some journals do a double blind peer review, some do a single blind peer review. the basic idea being that they will send your submission out to other people in the field, sometimes other editors on the journal. If the field is large enough, they'll send it just to kind of other people associated with the organization, and they'll solicit reviews. That process can take a very long time, oftentimes because it's unpaid labor. Nobody wants to do it. So sometimes we're talking on the order of months. For some people who are, looking to submit like tenure files in the future, in the near future, let's say, this process can be particularly troublesome if it takes like 2 years, let's say, for a journal article to get published. The journals that work really quickly are working on an order, on an order of a few months or something to get back to you. But it can take a very long time because everybody that they're reaching out to is probably teaching, doing research of their own, and also doesn't just want to, give it away for free. So what happens is your paper then gets submitted out to 2 reviewers. It could be, I said, single blind or double blind. A single blind is where let's say you wouldn't know who the reviewers are, but they might know who you are based on information in the paper. A double blind is where nobody knows who anybody is. So you won't know who the reviewers are. The reviewers won't know who you are. Sometimes you have to prepare your paper specifically for that, taking out any sort of identifying information. Although for small fields, everybody knows everybody, so it doesn't really matter. And then they will review the paper. And as they're reviewing the paper, they will give notes to you as the author of the paper, things that they find strong, troubling, et cetera, et cetera. But then at the end, they ultimately give their recommendation to the editor about whether or not this paper should be published. And usually it's like kind of published as is, published with minor revisions, which is usually kind of formatting issues, major revisions, where you either have to include some area of previous scholarship that you haven't looked at before, or they want you to do something under argument, or it's rejected. And then the editor takes those things into consideration. Sometimes the editor will solicit other reviews if they feel like they didn't get a good consensus on what should be done with your paper, but it always falls back to that editor. And then the editor will respond back to you about what happens next. So sometimes you hear about people getting like an R&R, a revise and resubmit, which is usually a good sign. Like, it's not the best. It's not like, hey, your paper's getting published, but it is a good sign. Hey, my paper has an audience. There's just something that needs to change about it, right? So there's this huge kind of gradient of different responses you can get, but that's the general process. And then after that, you make the changes, you send it back, depending on how significant the changes that were asked of you by the editor and by the reviewers. It might go through another review process, but that's kind of the cycle, right? Until finally it's published. Some journals have simultaneous online publishing and print publishing. Some obviously are just in print, some are just online. But that's the process, right? And I only emphasize that as a way to show you that there are a lot of different places where a lot of people are touching this, from grad students and the editor reading at the beginning, just kind of making blanket decisions based on, is this the right journal for this kind of argument, all the way down to the peer review, where they're actually kind of engaging in a very substantial way with the ideas you're presenting, saying, is this novel? Is this building on something? Is it complete bullshit? That kind of thing, right? So it's, not just, they're not just looking at the small parts of the argument. They're not looking at the big parts of the argument. They're not just looking at formatting. They're not just looking at like how well you write. It's kind of a combination of all of them at a lot of different times. I did separate at the beginning the kinds of journals into like maybe tiers, right? And so sometimes people will talk about like a top tier journal in their field. That's field to field. There are certainly like journals that have higher reputations than other journals in different kinds of fields. What I always encourage to graduate students especially is that you should look to see what are the kinds of journals in your field. Just get acquainted with the different kinds of journals that your field has. I know there are some programs here where the professors will talk about, like, if you publish in lower tier journals, you're signaling that your work is lower tier. I don't really buy that for graduate students. There's a lot of competition out there. At the same time, you want to publish in a journal that you feel like you are kind of contributing to a kind of central conversation that the journal's engaged in. You don't want to publish in a place you wouldn't want to read. This is kind of a sidebar. If anybody ever asks you to pay money to publish in a journal, just delete that. That's a pretty common kind of graduate level, oftentimes it's international journals that are looking for, like they kind of scan through conference programs to see, oh, this person gave a talk on this, and they'll offer to, you pay me $500 and you can publish in the journal. I'd say tend to avoid those, but if you need to fill out a tenure file, do what you got to do. But with that, that's just kind of the background information. What I want to talk about today specifically is kind of what kind of content decisions and organizational decisions do you have to make in your seminar papers in order to make them, quote, publishable. And I'm going to use that word, every time I use the word publishable, it's in scare quotes, right? Assume that it's in scare quotes because obviously different fields have different expectations of what goes into published work. And then kind of the goal of your published paper might be different than somebody else within your field if you're publishing in two different journals. Okay. With that kind of aside out of the way, are there any questions about that general process? Because I know sometimes it's hidden if you haven't worked with journals, that kind of stuff. But any general questions about that? Okay, great. Everybody, I sent, you should have access to the zipped file that I sent out called Journal Webinar Materials October 4th. If you'll unzip that, you will find, can everybody see my file screen here? Thank you, Counter. You'll find about 7 different files here, most of them PDFs. I think one of them is an HTML submission. But what I have done here is the most important one is the journal submission webinar outline. If you open that up, it is an outline of everything we're doing today. It's an outline kind of all the major points that we're going to be talking about today. And it's really a key to help you work through the other materials that we have today. Because what I've done, and I did this with an older Writing Center consultant, this guy, Michael Kemp, anybody who are familiar with him, he and I worked this out a few years ago. And so this is adapted from that, where we found 3 different journal articles from 3 different fields. So we have this one from the Journal of Strategic Information Systems by Naidu, 2016. We have an article from the Review of Religious Research by Hayward and Krauss. And then we have George et al. From the Academy of Management Journal, right? So 3 different journals from 3, fairly, 3 different articles from 3 kind of fairly diverse journals. Along with that, you'll see, and I've labeled it AA, BB, CC, I picked out the submission guides for each of the journals that these articles were published in, right? And we'll talk about what a submission guide is. But that way you can also see like what is expected of somebody who is publishing in the same journal that Naidu 2016 published in, okay? So each one of those articles too, you'll see is annotated with comments specifically about some of the different parts of a quote publishable paper that we're going to be talking about. And if anything, it's more to kind of set up for a series of kinds of questions that you can ask yourself about your paper as you get it prepared. Okay, so if anybody has any trouble accessing those materials as we go through them, because I'm going to be referencing them on my screen, of course, it's going to be easier to kind of read if you have your own, but I'll also email copies out afterwards. Okay, pardon me. So the first thing that I wanted to emphasize is actually something that Stephanie brought up in the beginning, right? This idea of, I don't want my paper as I'm submitting to a journal to feel like homework, right? And I'd say this is actually kind of the fundamental thing to think about when it comes to taking a seminar paper that you've written for class and turning it into a journal submission. Which is first to think, and this is kind of a rhetorical exercise, but to imagine from your professor's perspective, why did they ask you to write that paper, right? What is the goal of the seminar paper as it was assigned to you, right? In general, journal submissions and seminar papers have 2 vastly different goals. And because they have 2 different goals, that they need to be written in 2 different ways, right? The purpose of a seminar paper is to demonstrate to your professor that you've done the reading, right? To demonstrate to your professor that You can think about the kinds of themes, ideas, problems that were brought up in your class in an interesting way. Even if it is a research paper for a seminar paper, it's still kind of narrowly focused around the themes and topics that you've covered in the class, right? So a seminar paper, as much as it sets up maybe for future work that you want to do, is also very much just about, like, you know, giving receipts to your professor, demonstrating, hey, I've done the work. A journal article, on the other hand, is not at all considered or concerned with you having really done the work, right? The purpose of that journal article is obviously to help engage with some broader themes, you know, some broader issues, maybe broader problems that your field is concerned with. It needs to demonstrate, you know, engagement with prior study on this topic or prior argumentation on the topic, and is as concerned with kind of the, quote, state of the field that you're talking about as it is about the specific topics that you're focused on, right? So whereas a seminar paper is kind of really narrowly focused around making sure that you prove in a class that you've done this kind of work, the journal article is much more concerned with how your work engages with some sort of broader community, broader conversation, right? So this is where things like literature reviews come in that we'll talk about going through, right? But I think a lot of the, like, problems, questions, concerns, troubles that students have about what do I do with the seminar paper, to turn it into a journal submission, if you just start by thinking what about this seminar paper is unique from a journal submission, that can actually help you a little bit to, like, you know, in terms of like thinking what are the goals of these two papers. Okay. With that, let's jump into what we're going to do here, right? So if you open up the journal submission outline that I sent you out, you see that there are essentially 6 tips that I want to emphasize. These tips are not, you know, exhaustive. Obviously, there's a lot of different kinds of work that you can do to prepare your papers for submission. And in fact, where is it? This past month, a sociologist that I follow on Twitter, Jeff Gwynn, he was doing a peer review for a journal submissions, and he got some great term papers in and said, look, these are great term papers, but these are really bad journal articles. And so he made a little list here focused on what are the different ways that you should, like, what are the different considerations you should have as you turn your seminar papers in. So in addition to kind of the notes I have here, I think Jeff's set of tweets is really helpful. He goes a little bit more into kind of how you have to engage with literature differently in each format. But either way, it's a great resource as well. But if we're just to go over to the journal submission webinar outline that I have, I've highlighted 6 different things to increase the chances that your submission is successful. First thing, you need to create a research space, which is give context to your work. Make sure that you outline and organize your argument, right? So that there is in fact an argument and that you've outlined it for your reader. Making sure that you have tied your work to some issue of broader significance. And we'll talk about that. That doesn't have to be like fixing global warming, right? But it can be identifying how does your work speak to some issue of significance within your field, and however your field relates to, you know, the world, society. Making sure then that you've picked the right journal to submit to. Next, keeping your audience in mind. And then lastly, making sure, you know, then we get to the small details. A lot of times I think people think, you know, when I'm prepping my article for submission, I need to make sure I'm using the right citation format, getting, like, you know, spell check, things like that. I agree, all those are important. That's probably the last thing that I would do. So the second part of things that I want that, you know, that I have work for you to do during this session is I would like everybody real quickly to identify a journal, two journals within your field that you would be interested in submitting an article to, right? This doesn't need to, you know, you're not marrying it, right? This isn't, you know, it's not an exercise in like promising, right? But I am going to look at a lot of resources from the journals I have here, and I want you to be able to see, find resources for journals that you are interested in. So let's take 5 minutes real quick, And I would like you to identify 2 journals within your field that you'd be interested in publishing in. And if you can, if your field's large enough, try and make one of them what we'd call maybe like a flagship journal, right? One of the biggest, kind of most important journals in your field. And then another one, make it a smaller, more niche kind of journal. Maybe something a little bit more specific within your field. But I want everybody to have just 2 things that they can look at here, right? So find 2 journals, and if you can, bring up their web pages or any sort of web page that, you know, sometimes it's like through their publisher or something, okay? And I'll show you what I mean if you're not familiar with that. Share my screen here, right? So for example, I am in the field of religious studies. Can everybody see my Google search here? I think so, okay. So I'm in religious studies. So I know, and here, the journal that I used to work at, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, is the flagship journal of the American Academy of Religion. So I might want to see what they have. So they are a large enough journal, they have a full website, so I'd bring that up. But then maybe there is a smaller journal that I'd be interested in. Let's say something like Journal, Religion, Material, Culture, I think that'd be it. So Material Religion by Taylor and Francis. It's a smaller journal, not as kind of long and storied as JAR, but another journal that I might be interested in, right? And we can do some comparisons between the 2. But everybody, just take a few minutes and find 2 journals in your field that you would be interested in publishing. And if you have any trouble with that, or if you need ideas, feel free to shout out or post in the chat. Stephanie in chat. So you don't need the URLs. Bring up the web pages if you can find them. It's very useful for you as you kind of explore what the expectations of the journal are. But you're not, this is kind of the extent right now, just kind of prepping you to kind of look through some of this material as well. How's it coming for everybody? Everybody able to find at least 1 journal, maybe 2? Anybody want to share in chat what journals they found? Let's see. Let's see what Keandra's is. Black women, gender, and families. Great. Oh, cool. Yeah, this is a good. This is a. Let's see if I can find out this. Journal of American History. Okay, good. Seems like a lot of folks have a lot of good ones. And here, let me show you what I found here, because being able to kind of navigate some of these journal pages is really the first step to figuring out how you can prep your manuscript for submission. Okay. So the 2 I found, like I said, Journal of the American Academy of Religion and then Material Religion. One thing, again, this is more insider baseball if you're not sure about just how the journals work. You'll see both of them are associated with larger academic publishers, right? So JAR, the Journal of American Academy of Religion, published by Oxford. Material Religion, published by Taylor and Francis. Black Women, Gender and Families by Project Muse, right? So one thing you'll always find is that these journals are, they're not independently published. They're published through large academic presses. So a lot of times the specific rules for how things are presented in journals, the rules for citations, the timeline, all of this is really dictated by not just the editors themselves, but even larger structures than that. So, how it actually works is Oxford allots, let's say for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Oxford allots, the editor says, hey, this issue, you have 214 pages, right? And so it really comes down to something as minute as that, okay? No matter the journal, there are a few things that you should always look out for as soon as you find kind of the page that you're interested in. The first thing is they usually have some kind of about. So here's like the about page on the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and then Taylor and Francis always does along the side here. And there's kind of two abouts that you'd want to look for first. So you always want to look at just about the journal itself. In this case, they talk about just who's involved in it. But they also have, under submissions, a list of specific author guidelines, right? So information for authors, style, and instructions, right? So I'd always look first at what does the information for authors say. And if we go to the material religion page, you have a similar thing, instruction for authors, and like aims and scope, okay? Now this is really useful here because both of these journals identify kind of their aims and scope, and in doing so, they identify what is kind of the, like how broad should you be aiming for your argumentation here, right? This gets into the idea of like you want to be addressing the way that your research contributes to some understanding, help solve some kind of problem maybe within your field. But that's again very different than solving global problems. So when we look at JAR, you see that they emphasize that the words broad and fundamental are key. And writing for us, you're writing for the field of religious studies as a whole. Don't speak to the lowest common denominator interest of the JAR audience. You draw on a specific subfield, but you also need to offer content and conclusions that will be interest of people within the discipline as a whole. In material religion, you see that they're a topical focused journal. They're really interested in material culture, things like images, devotional, liturgical objects, rather than broad kind of like treatises on theology or something, right? So one thing to look at as you're picking a journal to submit to is first to consider, does the journal have some sort of methodological focus that you want to contribute to, right? Is it a journal of sociology, a journal of history, or does it have a topical focus? In this case, a focus on material religion over other kinds of religious, iconography or something like that, right? So thinking about what are the aspects of the journal, be it methodological, be it problem focused, be it subfield focused, thematic. Sometimes journals will have special issues, right? So there might be a gender and material religion special issue, right? Does your work fit into that, right? So when you're looking for a journal, I think fit is more important than rank. So always look for a journal that seems to fit either with your topical or thematic interest or methodological interest as well. Speaking of rank, sometimes journals will post things here, like you have journal metrics. You'll get the number of annual views or downloads. This is actually a pretty useful one. For material religion, you have 60 days from submission to first decision, 104 days to first post review decision, and 42 days from acceptance to online publication. So you put those all together, and on average, it's about 200 days from when you first submit your article to when it gets published, if everything goes right? I would imagine that these are pre-COVID numbers, so let's call it a year, okay? And then they have a 46% acceptance rate, okay? So you can find that on different places. Not every article publishes that information about themselves. The other thing to look for is, in addition to information for the authors, which I was just on that page, I don't know why I left. is information about how you have to submit things, right? So they'll tell you oftentimes information about the lengths, if you have to provide an abstract or not, something about the process. Here's this. And then every once in a while, you'll see that they have a specific style sheet, which I know I have a copy somewhere, but we'll open up another one. A style sheet where they will in fact tell you, sorry, Word is figuring it out. There we go. Where they will tell you specific information about the style of the journal that you're publishing in. Right now, most of these journals follow either APA or Chicago or MLA or IEEE. But again, because there's such strict page restrictions on all of this, usually there's some element of a house style involved too. So a lot of times they'll have a style sheet where they'll give you general information about how they want things, let's say, cited, or they want down style here, which means it's not highly formal, how to use block quotes and citations, things like that, right? So actually, as an example, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion uses author date version of Chicago, not the notes bibliography version, but there are actually some differences that save space. So they don't have much information about the publisher in some of these citations, right? So, but if you can, that's always a great place to check out too. And then besides that, the other information to look for on these would be the editorial board. And so this is my last note about figuring out what kind of journal that you want to publish in, would be that once you find a journal and you kind of figure out what that journal's focus is, looking at the aims and scope, the next two things you should do to figure out should your article go to this particular journal or another one is first look through the journal, right? If they're publishing the kinds of work that you're citing in your own article, it's probably a good place to submit to, right? Like you imagine these journals are trying to create some kind of conversation. So it only makes sense that if you are citing a lot from that journal, that might be a great place for your submission to go. The other thing you can do is check out what their editorial boards are, right? So in addition to the managing editors, they usually have a whole host of editors that are associated with it. And if any of those names are people that you are interested in working with, interested in conversing with, focus on issues that you are interested in, like in the advisory board, it might be a great place for you to publish, right? So both journals, I think, offer information about their editorial boards here. So. Okay, but that's just kind of the general information on finding and picking a journal. Are there any questions about that to begin with? Has this been helpful so far? Okay, I'll take it from Kendra. Thank you. Okay, so let's actually jump now into the articles that I sent out, right? So I have those 3 articles and the 3 different journals. And I want to use those articles as a way to highlight some of the things that I think are really important considerations as you are preparing your journal or your seminar papers to be submitted to a journal. So if you wouldn't mind, please open up first. Well, actually, if you could, open up all 3 of those articles. So the I do 2016 article, the George 2016 article, and then the and then the other one, pardon me, the Hayward article. Sorry, it got opened on a different tab for me. Okay, and so open it up and we'll look at some of these. We're not going to go through absolutely every part of the journal articles, but I'll show you kind of what are the things that we've highlighted to really emphasize to you, like what you can look out for. Okay. scroll out of here, pardon me. So cool, we'll start in the Naidu article. Move stuff around here. Okay. So the first thing, and this is what I'd say is the most important part of preparing your articles for journal submission, is that it's really, really important in your article that you create a research space, right? Now, if you've ever worked with us at the Writing Center before on a research paper, we've probably told you about CARS, creating a research space in some way, but it's doubly important for a journal because, again, the purpose of that journal article is to identify how the argument you are making fits into some broader conversation within the field. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of signaling phrases that that you can use in order to identify kind of where your work fits in, right? So let's look at this Naidu article, right? And it's something about change induce collective voluntary turnover in IT. I'm very happy I'm not in this field because I don't know what that means. But it actually helps that at the very beginning in the abstract, you see that they're talking about losing talented IT employees, right? So this is a problem that they're identifying at the get-go, right? So the more that you can identify kind of how your work fits into to contribute to an understanding of some specific problem in your field, that's really good. What I want to focus on, though, is after that abstract, in the introduction of the paper, on page 278 of the Naidu article, they have this framework here, where they say, although this study focuses on specific communicative practices that can account for the loss of talented IT employees, it also extends the general understanding of strategizing by framing practitioners as part of a dynamic social process. This is essentially this article calling its shot. The authors are saying, hey, this is what we are doing in the article. And your article, your submission needs to do something clear as well, right? Think about the way that you as a student or as a scholar read journal articles. It's usually pretty swift, right? Like you might mull over kind of the specific points, but first you want as much help from the author as you can, understanding how you should actually read it, right? So framing sentences like this, where the author is identifying this is what we're going to do, is really important. And that's paired here with this, and this is what we would call a statement of a research gap. Okay, so if you haven't been to the Writing Center before and you haven't heard us talk about CARS or creating a research space, it's essentially the process by which first you identify what is the state of previous research on this topic within a field. Second, what is missing from that conversation, what we'd call a research gap. And then third, how does your work fit in, right? A statement that is a while statement or an although statement is a really, really great articulation of a research gap. So, although press accounts have reported on a number of occasions that an organizational change somehow led to the collective turnover of IT employees, prior turnover research has been prone to admitting theorizing about the role of changing organizational context. Prior theorizing has also omitted blah, 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 right? So identifying, hey, prior studies have done this, prior studies have missed this, and therefore this is what we are going to do, right? You need to articulate where your work fits into an ongoing conversation. Now, for some things, this is easier than others, right? If there's like, a big hot button issue in your field that's been raging for decades, right? The field of religious studies that I'm in, we have one question. It's one big dumb question. What's religion? That's the only thing we ever talk about. It's easy for me to articulate how my work fits into that question. And obviously that's me being facetious. But for any sort of field, you always want to identify kind of what is the conversation look like as it is, and then how does your work contribute in some way to that, right? So that might mean that you are building on top of prior research. It might mean that you're kind of running into prior research saying there's something wrong with it. It might mean that you're taking prior research and applying it a new way to look at some sort of new condition. It might be that you're applying a new methodology to the same things that prior research have looked at, right? So I encourage you all to be kind of creative and open to thinking about what are the ways that your work extends or contrasts with or engages with prior scholarship, because it doesn't just have to be like taking out the big fish, right? It doesn't just have to be standing on the shoulders of giants. There are a lot of ways that you can relate your work to past work, and these 3 articles get at some of them. Following the creating a research space, and I won't go, I'll use the 3 articles to kind of look at different aspects, but I'm not going to go through each of them specifically. The next thing that I would say is tip 2, making sure that your work is outlined well and that your argument is organized really well. So if you've been again to the Writing Center before, you will know that a common thing that we have talked about before is the axes model, which is just a model of argumentation, where you start with a claim that you want to make, you work to support that claim with some kind of example, you explain how the example supports the claim if you need, and then you demonstrate the significance of your work overall, right? That same framework should flow throughout your paper. And so we have, in this case, taken each of the journal articles. So then I do 2016, Hayward and Krauss, 2014, et cetera. And we split up and really kind of reverse outline them to show what are the different kinds of outlining structures that they use, just to show you that there are some commonalities between them. Now, some journals require really specific kind of sections that they want, subheadings, right? Some require an abstract, some require a methodology section or a literature review section. Some might split your methodology section into a theories section and a methodology section. Regardless, though, all these journal articles are essentially following the same trajectory, which is first an introduction, is introducing some kind of problem of study. It doesn't have to be a real world, like tangible problem. It can be just a problem of interpretation within your field. Identifying where that problem is within previous scholarship, and then identifying how you are now going to contribute to the discussion. With that, I think it's really important that you think about in your paper, and this is a little bit different than a seminar paper maybe, is penning a roadmap for your paper, right? Usually comes at the end of an introduction and guides the reader through what each section of your paper does, right? Whenever I write these, I always start them in the dumbest way possible. I say this paper will do this section will do this, and then after that, then I go back in and I massage it to make it sound a little bit less like a robot and a little bit more like me. But a good roadmap can do a lot to clarify the argument that you're making for your audience. And I guarantee you, you've all read journal articles. The best journal articles are engaging, thoughtful, thought-provoking, and well-written. Most journal articles are not particularly well-written. A lot of them are much more mechanical. So if what's keeping you from getting this out the door is that you feel like it's not, artistic enough, that it's not like in your voice enough, that's okay. That work can be kind of done on the fly. I encourage you, I don't know of a single editor who's ever said this article is too mechanical, right? That an article isn't written in prose or anything like that, right? So it's okay to lean on a lot of these kind of old common, this paper does X, Y, Z, right? It's okay for now. With that, after calling their shots, relaying the structure of the paper, most will identify what their methods are. They will announce their results in some kind of way. They will analyze those results before leaning into a conclusion, right? This is a very typical social scientific structure of a paper, right? Whether or not it has a hypothesis section or not, it starts by introducing the specific problem, identifying where this particular piece fits in within that larger problem, explaining what it's going to do, and then doing it, whether that's through the announcing of specific results and then the analysis of those results, or whether, like in my field, it is the explication of text or something like that. Okay, even the third article starts the same way, right? Identifies previous literature and kind of what's at stake, then going into what itself is doing. And then this finally has actually a kind of going forward call to action thing, right? Demonstrating the significance, okay? So I encourage you, if you haven't, if you have your seminar paper and you're preparing it for journal submission, try reverse outlining it, which is where you do just what we did for these articles and you figure out like, well, what's the outline for the paper that I actually wrote look like? And you might say, oh, great, I have this introduction, I have a hypothesis, but I never actually explain what I'm doing in the paper. I need a section where I do that, right? Or you might read through it and you say, you know, this is great. I go through the implications of my research. I go through the results, but I never actually talk about the broader significance of what it is, right? So I encourage you, step 3, look through your papers and do some reverse outlining. Up next, make sure that your work is speaking to some issue of broader significance. And this again is the place where I think the difference between a seminar paper can be pretty stark, right? The seminar paper, again, the goals are specifically related to whatever kind of niche your class fits into, right? Whereas most of these journals are asking not just that you are writing for, you know, the 3 people in the world who are really, really interested in your subject and topic, but for the rest of the field to recognize how your specific subject or topic speaks to some issue of broader significance, right? So these are actually quotes from the journal's submission guides, right? So this is the Journal of Information Systems submission guide, and they are interested in changing nature of business and context of the emerging IT. That seems like a really big idea compared to how IT is normally, you know, talked about in common parlance, right? Considering issues of organizational transformation, implications, right? A lot of these journals are very forward focused in the sense of like, what do we take this knowledge and do with it? A lot of times they'll announce a specific disciplinary approach, right? So IT systems here is really interested in critical transdisciplinary approaches, and then they might even announce the kinds of topics that are being utilized here, right? So let's actually look at the, pardon me. Great, so the changes in religious group affiliation, so the Hayward and Krauss article, 2014, right? So we can start here with the CARS heading, right? Which is, again, where they are announcing the significance of their work. It is surprising that there has been little empirical research documenting the type of religious affiliation change during the course of older adulthood, right? So even without reading any of the rest of the paper, you now know that the subject of their paper is about older adults changing religious affiliation, and that that subject is understudied within the literature, right? So if we look near the end, now they're talking about the broader significance of their findings throughout, right? So this finding is at odds with another perspective. Likewise, the fact that older adults in the sample underwent changes did not tend to withdraw from organized religion altogether, but instead tended to switch affiliations runs counter to this other perspective, right? So in addition to identifying at the very beginning, hey, our research is going to fit into this kind of missing aspect of the conversation, you circle back to that at the end of your analysis to show, hey, this is how our arguments do or do not conform to what we already know about the subject, okay? You see at the end, there's even another summary. In short, these results are consistent with these expectations, right? So everything that they're doing, the last part here, is really demonstrating what is the broader significance of their work. And even they actually kind of, sometimes it's helpful, you know, to really kind of shoot a half-court shot. We hope that this study represents a first step towards understanding this uncharted aspect of religious change, right? The very last sentence, this is what we want for our research, right? So demonstrating the significance of your work as you understand it is really important at the end of, as part of your papers. Same thing here. Where is this? The paper here, paper C, ends with a call to action, right? There is no plan B for action. As scholars and educators, let me zoom in for you. There is a moral imperative that we should act to guide business leaders, employees, and stakeholders with systemic, unbiased, or systematic, pardon me, unbiased and empirically robust evidence. This special research forum is a step in that direction, right? Highlighting, hey, this is what you need to do with all the information I just told you, right? Some of these are a little bit broader than others, right? Like this is, as scholars and educators, having a moral imperative. Certainly that's a lot grander than saying we need to better understand why older adults change their religions. But regardless, no matter how they do it, each of these studies ends with some kind of evaluation of what its significance is, you know, kind of in the field. After that, and we've talked a little bit about this, making sure you have picked the right journal to submit to. One thing we didn't go into, and let me see if this will open up in. Oh. Okay, sorry. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Sorry, I don't know why this isn't opening up in my Chrome right now. I'm sharing it. Stop sharing. Sorry about that, folks. Give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. The link that you will find on the handout I've given you is actually just a special note about journal rankings, right? Journal efficiency, things like that. So I encourage you, that has a lot of different resources for looking at different qualities in journals, different lists, acceptable rates, journal impact. They have specific rankings that they use. Again, I am of the opinion that if it's a journal that you yourself have read into, it's a journal that, you know, you see things that you like are being published in, I think that's good enough. Do talk to your advisors. They all have their own special biases about what kind of journals are good and what kind of journals are not. But again, you know, see value in your own work, hope that others find that same value in it. You know, don't give in to grifters, but also make sure that you're not kind of letting, you know, the top tier journal get in the way of you publishing it in a fine journal. Okay. One thing to do too is feel free to check out the CVs of professors that you really admire, see where they're publishing a lot, right? If they are, and here for younger scholars here, everybody, I would suggest looking at the CVs of younger scholars as well, right? A lot of times, and this is probably anecdotal, my experience has been from seeing kind of more established scholars in the field, people who've been around since like the 70s and 80s. It's a little easier to publish in some of the kind of top tier kind of mainline journals, right? And there are just a lot more journals out there now doing kind of more interesting creative work on the side. So if somebody who seems like they haven't published since 1980 is telling you like, if you don't publish in this journal, then you're nothing, take that with a grain of salt. You know, look out for what you got there. There's a question in chat. Is it bad to start publishing for small online only peer review journals? I think you said the right thing. Peer review is the first place you want to look, right? So there are lots of journals that aren't peer review where you know you're going to be able to get your information out there. I would say unless you are just kind of interested in getting an idea out there, you're not necessarily interested in like kind of building the CV, those are fine. If it's an online only peer review journal, that can be really good, right? Like everything we've seen here and looked at, a lot of these journals, you know, are associated with larger publishing houses. That costs a lot of money to run, right? So if a journal or if a publisher like Oxford doesn't feel like they're getting their return on investment, they're just going to drop the journal. So I do think that there are actually a lot of strong online only things. Again, just like kind of with anything else, going through those steps we outlined at the beginning to say like, hey, is there an editorial board? Does the editorial board seem, you know, like they're on the up and up? Are they publishing things that you look at and are impressed by? I think all of that information to me is more important than if, you know, if they happen to publish with Taylor and Francis or something like that, right? So if you ever have questions about that, do bring in your advisors, your professors on that information. But I am of the opinion, having worked in the journal publishing industry, that it is a changing industry, and it is not necessarily that things are just getting online and therefore easier and bars lowering, anything like that, that there's lots of really thoughtful, rigorous work that's done online, but that isn't necessarily recognized in the same breath as, like, you know, the prestige journals from before. Other good places to look are, there are more and more kind of quasi-academic, almost quasi-journal magazines online, and online magazines that are getting a lot of interesting press lately. So for those of you in history, let's say, or history adjacent, I'll always like to highlight this because they do such great work. There is Contingent Magazine is a great example. It's a lot of folks who are prior academics, people who moved out of the academic space or doing kind of more public academic service now. But they do publish a lot of really thoughtful, kind of pretty academic articles, but that are for public consumption as well. So if you are interested in publishing because you want your ideas out there, but you actually want those ideas read, then something like Contingent is actually a really good thing. And seeing, does your field have other sorts of, you know, what is now being called like alt-ac opportunities to publish, because they can be, you know, really, I think, like, I use Contingent stuff in the classes I teach all the time. I think it's accessible and rigorous, and that's more than I can say for a lot of journal articles for sure. I'll check that in a second, Stephanie. Let me get to the last 2 points so we can get folks out of here too. So the last 2 tips we have, and this is related to everything we talked about, keeping your audience in mind, right? So some journals will actually explicitly identify the kinds of people you'll be writing for. You saw earlier when we looked at the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, they said, hey, write for the whole field, but don't dumb it down. Right, some journals will actually like give archetypical people, right? So Strategic Management Systems says like IT executives, consultants, right? So there's a very professional academic split on this. For some of your field, especially folks in public health, especially folks in psychology, some in politics, certainly, there is a professional academic divide in the field about what kinds of work you're, like education's another one, where it's, are you writing for practitioners? Are you writing for people who are working in the academy trying to kind of further theory and understanding of it? Those are kind of different audiences to keep in mind. And then lastly, you know, after you've considered all that, that's when I think you should start worrying about formatting considerations. Now, certainly, now in my experience, most journals that are not like the top tier journals that are just, you know, pushing people away every which way, formatting is usually not enough to keep a submission from moving forward. That being said, higher tier journals are always looking for a way to thin out submissions, so you should do your best to follow formatting guidelines when you can, right? But there have been plenty of times doing kind of desk reviews for Journal of American Academy of Religion. It needs to be in Chicago author date. If it comes in an APA, I'm not kicking it out the door, right? That is a very editor to editor thing. There are some editors who, boy, do they love their citation formats. So they will look for any reason to like lower the number of submissions. There are others though, that if they like your argument, they like what you're doing, they like the piece that you're making, nothing's gonna get in the way of that. And then those kind of formatting considerations will come on down the road. But if I can just reemphasize, think about how your work fits into a broader conversation as you kind of revamp your paper for journal submission. Really think hard about what kind of journal you want to submit to. Is it methodologically focused? Is it topically focused? How have you organized your argument for the reader? What have you done to signal to your audience what the significance of the work that you're doing is and how your work fits into a broader conversation? And then after all that, how is your formatting look? Okay. But with that, obviously, all those materials I gave you, all those PDFs are annotated with notes about the specific language that the different authors use to signal transitions and signal kind of research gaps and things like that in their article. So I encourage you to take a look at it. Feel free to drop by the Writing Center with those materials if you ever want to meet with one of our consultants and actually talk about some of the issues that are brought up in that, or how your papers do or don't accomplish those things. And again, anyone at the Writing Center will all be happy to help you, you know, prep your seminar papers for journal submission. Okay. With that, though, I'm going to end it. Stephanie, I'll take a look at that link right now. But are there any questions as I turn off the recording?